Welcome everyone to Mayo Clinic Q&A. I'm Dr. Helena Gazelka. To keep ourselves and others safe during the pandemic, many of us have started working from home or working from our offices with social distancing and using virtual technology to connect with others. In fact, much of our lives has gone virtual. But how does this affect us both physically and psychologically? Today, we have the Department Chair of Psychiatry and Psychology at Mayo Clinic, Dr. Jeffrey Staab, here to discuss this with us. Thanks for being here, Dr. Staab.
Well, thanks for having me, Dr. Gazelka. I'm pleased to be here.
I am fascinated by this topic because it isn't something that I had thought of much before, other than that, people are always on their phones all the time. But now every meeting that we do is Zoom. You and I are meeting by Zoom this morning, and it has really, I think, profoundly changed the way that we interact. And so I'm really fascinated to hear your take on this morning.
Well, I'm glad to join you. I mean, we've thought about this as well. A lot of people have written about about virtual meetings and how they're changing the way that we communicate. So it's certainly, we don't have all the answers, but we've got a number of things that people have thought about, and happy to talk with you about those today.
Oh, I'm really excited to talk about it. One of the most profound areas that this is in my practice and in your practice, I'm sure too, is that we are not only having Zoom meetings with our colleagues, but we are also seeing our patients virtually. And my little grandson is going to school virtually, as so many other children are. And I'm wondering, how does a meeting that is virtual or a contact that is virtual differ from what we would have from an in-person meeting? How does that affect our interactions?
Well, there's no single answer to that question. I think there's, because just as you said, there's varied uses for virtual technology in varying settings, and it's having different effects. So if we take your grandson, for example, kids are a little bit more facile with this kind of technology than some others, but it is a decrease in connectedness, in human connectedness, when we move from something like school or the clinic to a virtual meeting. But on the other hand, I'm actually having more virtual meetings than phone calls these days. So because the technology has become so easy to use, people say, "Oh, I'll just send you a connection, and we'll do it virtually, rather than something that we may have handled by a phone call." So it seems that lots of things are moving in this virtual direction, some of which are taking us a little further away, but some of which are connecting us a little bit more.
I agree with what you said about phone calls. We used to have so many phone conference meetings at Mayo. In other words, if you couldn't get there, or if you were meeting with someone at one of our other locations, you would do it on a phone conference. But now I've really enjoyed the Zoom. I will say, though, that I still sort of have this craving or desire to actually be in a room meeting with people. Do you think that meeting with people virtually, that it's the same sort of human connection when we can see someone and hear someone, that it is when we're in the same room with them?
No, it's not. It's not in a number of levels, and we can talk about what the limits are. But I think before we go into that, it's important to I think put this in context, and that is that virtual meetings are really the latest in a long line of human beings maintaining connections when they couldn't be together. I mean, we've had mail, we've had other messengers, we've had all kinds of things going back to ancient times, and so human beings crave connections, but we've also found ways with available technology to make those. And so going from the phone to email to Facebook and other kinds of connections, to text messaging, to the other more instant messaging kinds of things. I mean, these virtual meetings are really just the latest in a long line. So while the focus for us today is on virtual meetings, I think we can't forget that for as long as human beings have existed, for as long as we know about people doing things, they've been reaching out to connect to one another in distant ways.
That's true. I've often pondered the changes that I have seen over my own lifetime. My kids, of course, are adults now, but cannot fathom the fact that I used to have to use a payphone when I wanted to call someone if I was away from home, or make sure that my parents had the phone number at someone's home or something like that. And now we FaceTime with people around the world and can connect with them virtually. So it is
Right.
pretty amazing.
So I think to go back to your question, though, the first thing that we have to do is to recognize that just as people have in previous times with previous technologies, that we have to accept the limitations of what this can do, and that's first and foremost. So when people say, "Is this a substitute?" The answer is no. It is an alternative because it can't absolutely substitute for the way that we can connect in person. So if we just say it's going to accomplish some of the tasks, we're going to be able to communicate information. But some of the things that we need to do in person can't be done virtually. Some of that, really the subtleties of being connected to one another. There's only two senses that come across on the virtual medium. That's sight and sound. None of the other senses come across: touch, smell, those kinds of things. And so our more intimate connections can't be maintained as well. There's greater limitations there.
That's really interesting. Do you think that there are ways to enhance the experience of a virtual connection? And one thing that I'm thinking of is you and I both have a colleague who has suggested that we need to start treating virtual meetings like we would in-person meetings. So if we would bring our lunch to an in-person meeting over our lunch hour, we should bring our lunch to a virtual meeting as well. What other ways can you think of to enhance that experience so it's a little more personable?
Yeah, so I think that we've done some things that have made these meetings more difficult, and I think some of the aspects of it, get to the question of, should we be eating on the screen? So let's just chat about those for a minute. I noticed in my schedule just a couple of days ago. I talked with my secretary about this. When I opened my schedule, it was jam-packed with back-to-back virtual meetings for 6 hours, all through the lunch hour. Not, I mean, through lunch break. So there was no lunch break, no time away from the screen. And that's not how we would run our other schedules. I mean, yes, we've all had busy days, and where we were running from one thing to another. But sitting in one place for 6 or 8 hours straight without, getting up to move around, is one of the strains that isn't a natural one for us as humans. So being sedentary for that long, the visual strain of excessive screen time, and the unnatural visual cues that come on the screen, the fact that people are two-dimensional rather than three-dimensional, even with good video technology. The fact that there are these subtle, slight little delays in responses, that it's hard to pick up the subtle cues that we all give to one another about when we're done conveying our topic, when we're open or asking for other people to pick up the conversation. Those are all more difficult. And people, we're more in each other's faces. I mean, your face, my face right now are, sort of just less than 2 feet away from me to my computer screen. So if you were eating, you would be eating just right there. And so I think that we have to think about some of the differences in how people come across on the screen versus not. And then, um, so when we think about then some of the, you and I, neither you or I are etiquette experts, but we could talk a little bit about these kinds of things. And I think that just keeping in mind how the flow of the give and take is different, and how it may be a little bit more distracting to have somebody um, eating or doing something else. I mean, I know on meetings that I can see that people have muted themselves, but they're clearly doing something else in the middle of the meeting. They're answering their emails or those kind of things. And I think people are a little bit more susceptible to doing some of those kinds of things that they may be than it may have been if they were in person.
Oh, I totally agree with you. I think that in an in-person meeting, when we're all sitting around a conference table, it would be rare that you'd see someone whip out their phone and start, texting or something. But a lot is hideable when you're on a screen, and so I do
Right.
think that people, your mind wanders and start answering emails and thinking about other things. I like what you said about the physical part of being sitting in front of a computer screen for so many hours of the day. It seems exhausting to me. I have the luxury of having a sit to stand desk, so I change
Mhm.
positions a lot, but I don't even have the 5 minutes to go walk to another meeting. I'm just sitting here all day. And I feel like by the end of the day, I'm just exhausted. I don't know if that's physical or psychological or what that is.
I think it's probably some of each. So, the idea about uh, video fatigue people have talked about Zoom fatigue or other companies as well, not just Zoom. But the video conference fatigue. But some of the research on that actually goes back to the 1980s and 1970s, the days when computers were first really being used, and there were people whose job it was to sit in front of screens. And so the eye strain and fatigue, even data that showed that the tear film breaks down a little bit more when you sit in front of a screen all day long than if you're up doing other kinds of things. So there are all kinds of subtle little physical changes. And there's also been research from the world of sort of motion, about how subtle differences in motion are more where the motion is unnatural, um, are fatiguing to us. And so when people say, the screen just wipes me out, I feel tired, I can't concentrate, I feel irritable and edgy, some of those symptoms go back to research done in the early years of NASA, and when they were trying to figure out what astronauts would be like when they were in space and without gravity, so moving in unnatural ways. So some of those same kind of things, these subtle little differences in motion, sitting in one place but having movement around us be different, are things that people have looked at for quite a few times, for quite a while, and now potentially apply to all these lengthy sit downs that we have in front of our computer.
Something that you said a little bit earlier piqued my interest, and that was about etiquette, and that we are not Miss Manners or etiquette experts. But one of the things that I have wondered about is some of the etiquette of meetings, as far as sometimes even how people schedule meetings. They schedule them just back to back. And so if you run over 2 minutes on one meeting, you're not logged into the next one, and it's very difficult to get a drink of water or go to the bathroom. And what other ideas do you have for how we give breaks, or how we treat others during virtual meetings that will make it more enjoyable for all of us?
Yeah, I think that the first thing is that you just said about scheduling. So, when I mean, why was my schedule packed, back to back to back to back, with meetings that lasted anywhere from 25 to minutes to an hour, a couple of days ago? And the answer is because different people filled those in. And so from each individual person's standpoint, if they said, well, I just found 20 minutes on Dr. Staab's calendar, what they expected was they were going to have all of those 20 minutes. But, 1 minute before and 1 minute after, I was with somebody else. So I think one of the things that we may have to agree to is that a 60-minute meeting is 50, and that a half an hour meeting is 25. And so that everybody has the expectation that we're not going to run up to that very end, because all of us will have different places to go. So thinking about building those breaks into the calendar, we get to get up and stretch, we get to use the bathroom, we get to have a lunch break, we get to just have a visual break for a few minutes before moving into the next meeting. Those are things that we would have in the natural world, that we're not having with this amount of screen time.
Yeah, or even just the time to switch gears. Like what
Yeah.
you said earlier, you're with someone a minute before and now you're in another meeting. And I often find that difficult because it might be a totally different topic. I'm working on this, I'm working on that. And so I don't have time to kind of pull up in my mind or even on my computer what will be necessary for that next meeting. So I like that thought of the shorter 50-minute and 25-minute meetings.
Yeah. And
Jeff,
then I think just right now, the sort of just pausing for just a second to to let the camera and the audio switch. We don't have to do that in person. We can tell when somebody is sort of winding down and they're ready to engage others, and that's just harder. It's only a fraction of a second, but how many times have you apologized for stepping on somebody's stream of thought or comments in a video meeting? I mean, it happens in other meetings too. But I remember I've got connections in with family and friends who are teachers, and just um, in grade school teachers. And of course, they're used to kids running around and doing all things all together. But it's very different when that's happening in all these little boxes on the screen, versus in a classroom where you can really kind of have an intervention, even briefly, that kind of casts a different tone across the entire meeting as opposed to having to do it 27 times.
Yeah, that is a very interesting comment. We have talked so much while producing this Q&A. Now that we've moved to this virtual format, it's very different for us. And about how I'm trying not to interrupt the speaker because it makes the camera switch, and that makes the conversation a bit more stilted and not as natural as it would be if we were really sitting in a room together.
Yeah, all of these little things add up, and I think it's so it's not any one, and there's not any one thing that we should be doing differently, but I think we have to keep in mind all of these. So setting our expectations for what we can and can't accomplish, not pretending that this is going to be a substitute for being in person, and just and as long as the pandemic is around, accepting that that's just the way it's going to be, and so that way what we have available to us meets our needs and meets our expectations. And then these some of these subtle things that we've talked about with regard to etiquette and sharing information, and it's just a different means of communication, and I think that's really what we ought to consider it to be, is not a substitute for everything that we want to be as humans, but a decent and useful tool of communication in addition to the others we have.
Jeff, I know the focus today was not necessarily on school and how it is affected by virtual contact and by virtual education, but I've really, because of my grandson and all of my coworkers whose children have been affected and are learning at home now virtually, I have really wondered what impact that will have on these children as they grow older, having had this experience, and will it change the way that they interact with others? And is it concerning in any way that we're having to resort to that type of education?
Yeah, the answer is I don't think we know yet. And not, but if we back up a little bit, there is a growing body of research on social media and its effects on kids. And this is in many ways an extension of that, a more formal kind of extension of that to the classroom and other places. And the answer seems to be that it's mixed. That there are circumstances and situations and types of children that thrive on these on these tools. There are other situations in which it can be detrimental, not in new ways, not like human beings have invented new things, but that it's more immediate. So, for example, bullying. Because bullying's been around ever since there were playgrounds, probably since before there were playgrounds, but it only happened sort of locally. Um, and whereas now, when you look at something like cyberbullying, it's worldwide instantaneously. And so some of the human interactions are magnified and more immediate. And I think that also applies in the classroom. So disruption can spread very rapidly. As a teacher is trying to attend to one kid on one screen and then move to another, another one, another screen. Whereas in a classroom, everybody's sort of more connected right then and there. So I think that while it is very reasonable to ask questions about what is this going to mean for kids who can't get this time back, I think that we shouldn't be completely pessimistic about the outcomes, because there are some positives that are likely to come from it, and I think we just have to try to get to the bottom of those as quickly as possible and mitigate the things that are not as helpful and celebrate the ones that are, and that's going to take some time and effort, and people, educators and others paying close attention to it.
Yesterday, I was speaking with a family practice colleague, and he was telling me that his clinic is full of patients who are struggling with anxiety and depression related, or mood disorders related to COVID, most of them feel. And I was recalling that some time ago, maybe last year, so I'd spoken to one of your colleagues about the increase in anxiety disorders among younger adults. And I am wondering, how do you think that COVID is going to affect this in the future? And what can we be doing to help those who may be struggling with those issues now during this really difficult time?
Yeah, so there's a couple pieces to your comment. One is the background again, is that COVID is not falling on sort of a blank slate. And that is that over a century, really, we've seen cohorts of kind of decade by decade cohorts increase rates of depression and anxiety disorders, and more recently, suicide. So it's the COVID is falling on trends that are going in the wrong direction for us as you know, as a country and as a human race. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And I think then this is a challenge that is an unusual one for us as humans. Not the first time, obviously. We know there have been other pandemics, there have been wars, there have been other things that have isolated people and economic crises and those kinds of things. But this is, you know, one where it's kind of all coming together. And one of the concerns that I think people have raised that we don't have an answer to, but is our social connectedness different? And I mean, not technology connectedness, but connectedness in families, in communities, in clubs and organizations, in those kind of things. There's some sense that we've moved a bit away from that level of connectedness to more technology-based kinds of things, and maybe now that we're having to be confined in places where that kind of connectedness might help a little bit more, missing it is an important element that doesn't give us as much social resilience as a community as we might have had. We don't know that that's the answer for sure, but that's one of the concepts that has been raised. So I think that to get through this is to recognize that number one, this is our challenge. Other generations have had their challenges, and not everybody has come through it well, but as a community, we have. And so, you know, taking the time to reach out to people who seem not to be struggling as much, who are struggling as much, who seem not to have as many resources, either internally or externally, to support resilience is one important thing. This is a time for us to be a human race, not just an individual human being.
That's a great comment. And I think that's more difficult because we aren't really out seeing our neighbors as much, or our coworkers as much. So it actually takes some very conscious thinking to remember to check on people, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff. This has been a really fascinating conversation for me, and I'm glad that we've been able to have this discussion today.
Well, thanks, Helena. I appreciate you inviting me.
Thank you so much to Dr. Jeffrey Staab, who is the Department Chair of Psychiatry and Psychology at the Mayo Clinic. I hope that you've gotten some good ideas and learned something as I have today, and we do wish you a wonderful day.
Mayo Clinic Q&A is a production of the Mayo Clinic News Network and is available wherever you get and subscribe to your favorite podcasts. To see a list of all Mayo Clinic podcasts, visit newsnetwork.mayoclinic.org. Then click on Podcasts. Thanks for listening, and be well.